Sí, escuchamos bien. Qué bueno. Bueno, que tengan buen evento todas. It's a pleasure to meet again in this new edition of the Regional Forum on Education Policy of the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning. From the Office for Latin America and the Caribbean of the IIEP UNESCO, with the support of the Organization of Ibero-American States for Education, Science and Culture, and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, we welcome you to this high-level technical event whose theme this year is Planning the Education of the Future in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm Mercedes Renault. I'm the Executive Officer of the Regional Office of the IIEP UNESCO, and throughout the day I will be presenting the different moments of the work agenda that we will be sharing. The organization of the Regional Forum is part of UNESCO's effort to support member states of the region in the implementation of the commitments of the Education 2030 agenda. This year, in particular, we are very happy because after 4 years of holding the forum in 100% virtual format, this edition will be in a hybrid format to be able to continue reaching all corners of the region and at the same time recovering the face-to-face instance that is so valued. So this forum will take place over 2 days, today and tomorrow. Today we will have 3 discussion panels led by specialists in educational policy and management. These panels will address how planning can facilitate progress towards a systemic and sustained improvement of education in the region in a context marked by profound economic, social and cultural transformations. The second day, which will take place tomorrow, Wednesday, will be completely virtual with an exclusive invitation to technical teams and officials from different areas of government and will consist on 3 panels on digital technologies, data, and crisis-sensitive educational planning. So these are 3 key working areas to face the challenges of education that we consider strategic, and we've been working on different projects throughout the region through our 3 main lines of work: production and mobilization of knowledge to promote the implementation of evidence-based policies, technical cooperation actions for the comprehensive development of the capabilities of the teams at the ministries, secretariats, and the strengthening of the local institutional capacity, and our well-known training programs for the government teams to have more and better tools and knowledge to plan the education of the future. Today we have the pleasure of having representatives from ministries and secretariats from all the region, also from provinces and subnational states, as well as specialists from international organizations, NGOs, and foundations. This event is being broadcast live through the Regional Forum's website in Spanish, Portuguese, and English. So we also greet all those people who are joining us now through YouTube. Let's move on to the opening remarks. We will be welcoming then Andrés Belich, Deputy Secretary General of OEI, Carlos Torrendel, Secretary of Education of Argentina, Esther Cuix-Laroche, Director of UNESCO Santiago, and Martín Benavides, Director of the IIEP UNESCO. An applause for all of them. While the authorities come up on stage, we invite you to participate in an activity. We'd like to ask you a few questions to know your opinion about some of the topics we'll be discussing today, and for that we will use Menti. Perhaps you have already answered this over breakfast, but those who haven't, please scan the QR code that you will find printed on the back of the agenda for the forum, and that will take you directly to the questions. And for those who follow us on YouTube, we are sharing the link in the chat right now. We will be collecting the answers at the beginning of the panels. So now the floor is yours, Andrés Belich. Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here On behalf of the OEI, I'd like to welcome all of you. This is a very special meeting for us for many reasons. First, because it's the International Institute on Educational Planning that has such a relevance for those of us, particularly in my generation. You know that it was directed by Juan Carlos Tedesco. I'm sure he was a professor of many of you here, including myself. So we have a personal love for the institution beyond the academic and institutional respect. So I'm so happy to be here today supporting the IIEP UNESCO Forum. And second, because for the OEI, this is an important moment. We are celebrating our 75th anniversary in the next few days. We will also receive the award for Ibero-American Cooperation, Princess of Asturias. I mean, we are at a very special moment in our development as an international organization. So working with the IIEP in this area and participating in this forum is very stimulating for us in the region. With UNESCO, well, I don't need to say it, but we've worked with several UNESCO offices. We have a significant cooperation with them. As you know, the OEI is part of the steering committee for the 2030 agenda, so we work closely with the regional committee, with the Chile office, with the Montevideo office as well in the area of science particularly. And of course, we work with the IIEP, the Institute of Higher Education as well. I mean, with all the offices of UNESCO, we've been building this collaborative work that has allowed us to develop one of the foundations of the OEI. That is that together we can do it better. This is a principle that pushes us to look for partners in different activities. And of course, a natural partner in education is UNESCO. So we are very happy and proud of what we are doing. One of the important topics where we are developing our work, as we work with several offices and with UNESCO Paris, well, it has to do with the next Gen report that will be related to the distributed leaderships in the global report, where the OEI is supporting the GEN to develop the Latin American part. And this is important, and I mention this because it has to do with one of the topics that has to be included in our agenda for Latin America and the educational reform. It has to do with the governance models we want for our educational system. How do we cope with a world that has changed centrally, that has left the vertical models behind and are moving towards more participatory models where the unit of education, the school, is again the center not only of education but also in many cases of planning. And in this area, there's a direct connection in what we're going to discuss in these 2 days, and this central work that has to do with what is happening in Latin America with these types of leaderships and these types of autonomy models. For us from the OEI, bringing this discussion and putting this at the center of the planning, these governance models that are different from those that were traditionally used in Latin America, it has to do with thinking or rethinking how the school can include everybody, not just at the school itself, but most importantly in knowledge, because although in Latin America we keep being indebted with millions of kids out of the system, we have a bigger debt that we have to include them beyond the school, include them in the knowledge. So I think that in that sense, this is a combination of what we expect will be approved by the ministers. In a few days, we have the meeting of the governing board where the ministers will be present. So we will present this program. And one of the essential topics there has to do with the governance systems, the leadership in the education system, leadership at the schools, how to construct different leaderships in Latin America, and how we can make that have an impact on the learnings of the youth and on their stay at school. So being here with all of you at the IIEP, that is so relevant for all of us, particularly the IIEP office in Buenos Aires, of course the Paris office that has this value in terms of training for all of us. Participating in this activity with this institution that has been so involved in the region, and we interact so much with the OEI. You know, we have 19 offices and we are always interacting with ministers of education and with teams, many of whom were trained under the IEEP programs. So we are so proud of this, and we try to share our knowledge, but also to learn and push discussions again in the region that we think are important. The pandemic, the funding problems have led to perhaps postpone some discussions we were having in the region, and I think it's important for us to resume those areas like governance, team building, both in the ministries and in the schools themselves, because there, with these models of distributed leadership, they are defining the planning of the educational unit. So welcome from the OEI. Thank you, IIEP, for this opportunity of sharing this task with you. Thank you, UNESCO in general, for the effort, the shared effort, and for allowing us to be with you in this effort that is the challenge of making a fairer education in our region that includes all and gives everybody the possibility of developing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andres, and thank you so much for welcoming us here at the OEI. Now we're going to give the floor to the Secretary of Education of Argentina, Carlos Torrendel. The floor is yours. Well, I'll try not to fall from here.
Exactamente. Sí, no cabe duda.
I'm close to the edge of the stage. We're always on the edge.
No sé todavía qué hacemos acá.
I don't know what we're doing here. Okay. I have 2 or 3 very short comments. First, the first thing that happened to me when I was appointed for this position, I wanted to ask what was the paradigm for educational planning that we could have in this context in Argentina in the 21st century. And, well, we didn't find any answer to that. The truth is that we were wandering and visiting different agencies and offices, and still today, with this popular situational planning that Inés also brought to light in Latin America with many others. Obviously, we have the issue of complexity. I mean, many words that come to us in this context. And I was just discussing with Esther, Luli, Alejandro, as to how we plan the education policy in such a complex scenario. We didn't find any book, to guide us and to start us in this journey. So I was very happy to learn about this forum. So perhaps, well, I won't be able to stay here all along, but, well, thank God this is being recorded. So I will be listening to it gradually in the next few days. So this is a first level team, and so please help us find an answer to these questions, because the truth is that we keep using this classical joke that is that we have schools from the 19th century, teachers from the 20th century, and students from the 21st century. Well, that hides those that are truly responsible, and that is us, because we have educational policies that are not even the policies of the 19th century. Wish they were, because at least they offered a solution for their context. So, as a general framework, our education policies, I think, still have not found a consistent dynamics related to the current culture that somehow starts not so much in a micro level, but in a more macro level to provide some solutions. And in that sense, in these past few months, I want to share a couple of things that perhaps will be useful. I mean, they were significant for me at least, and they may be food for thought. The first thing that I saw after we asked and we found no answers is the decision we made around literacy. In December, we presented this problem, I mean, the problem of the essential learnings. We call it literacy. Then, unanimously, we managed to reach some agreements at the Federal Council. And in some visits all over the country, I had the feeling initially that putting the focus on something that is so wide encompassing, but it's not something close, because literacy allows us to act in a cross-cutting way in the educational policies. So it seems to be that it's an initial answer so far. We found a Secretariat of Education, former ministry, that had 700 programs in that logic of the educational system, always adding. This is like in high school, huh? We add subjects endlessly. Well, the same happens in terms of the educational policies. We add programs to solve problems, but everything is scattered. So the focus, I think, is helping. I have the feeling that having a focus has two advantages. One is that it effectively creates a common culture in the educational system and within the ministries. And if the focus is wide enough, it allows us to do something that is more cross-cutting. We have to start thinking more as to how to guide this in order to have a few focuses that can be cross-cutting. And this leads to the next challenge where we are involved right now, and that is how we organize the ministries for that situation. We have an organization chart that is very similar to the organizational charts of the 19th century in our ministries. A big part of our ministries is still designed following that logic. So how do we modify that? How do we leave something, but we make them more hybrid with other dynamics for organization? That's another question that we're also dealing with right now. And finally, I think that there's no question that we have to go deeper into the relationship between planning, evaluation, and funding. We also found a classical funding logic, that is the distribution. Well, Axel put a name to it that is metaphoric, that is giving out and praying. We have a logic for distributing resources that effectively is not so connected to a certain logic of incentives. There has to be some connection between that distribution of resources and some accountability, not only administrative, but also in terms of the outcomes, the educational outcomes. Some deeper analysis is, well, what is being incentivized with this or other way of distributing resources? I insist we are not behaviorists, but there is a connection between the objective and the subjective part that we have to understand. Those are some of the things that I have experienced in these past few months that invite us to think better and try some new pathways for articulation. And finally, if we are moving from a paradigm of the educator state focused on the educational programs where towards an educator society, where society plays a role, where the formal learning is beyond the school, in that passage from one paradigm to another, that doesn't mean leaving the state behind, but having a wider dynamic. How are we going to plan education with that strong participation of civil society that is increasingly necessary and that is increasingly willing? Well, there I think is where we have to dive and find new paradigms. So those are simply the brief overview of the challenges and learnings in these past few months. I hope this will continue. If you have the solution, we are here. This is our address, Pisurno 935. Please, we'll be waiting for you there. We can schedule a meeting, or you just can knock at the door and you say, I have the solution. I will interrupt everything and we will get together. I should add there's not a lot of money. So there's no money. There's not a lot of money, I would say. But jokes apart, thank you so much. And I'm sure this will be a very rich meeting given the names that will be present, even those also that are following us remotely. So I'm very happy about this, and I'm sure this will be very useful for everybody.
Muchísimas gracias, Carlos. Me vuelvo un poquito al precipicio.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm too close to the edge here. So now I'll give the floor to Esther Cuix-Laroche, Director of UNESCO. Planning for future education in Latin America and the Caribbean is quite relevant, but also quite challenging. This is what we discussed earlier this morning with the Secretary of Education. The world is changing rapidly, and we are facing multiple challenges, but we are also undergoing a technological revolution. This forces us to revisit our education systems. This is not an easy task. How can we make them relevant for tomorrow? We see a growing complexity in our education systems with new challenges, new demands, resources that are not enough. And all this requires greater efforts for education planning and management. There is a recent report produced between UNESCO, ECLAC, and UNICEF shows that this region is going through major crossroads. Here we see a lot of inequalities in our countries that also reflect on education, but we also have some historical challenges that have to do with the right to education. But we also need to deal with the new challenges arising. So, in a world where education is no longer about transferring knowledge, but also looking at how students use this knowledge to deal with the challenges in this rapidly changing world, we need to consider that we need to educate citizens that should coexist with the planet, a world that is going through a lot of uncertainty. We need to make sure that they build more equal, more egalitarian societies with more economic development. Along the same lines, the Global Report on the Futures of Education indicates that in these challenging times, we need to reimagine the education of the future so as not to leave anyone behind. Unfortunately, we are leaving a lot of people behind. Our ministers of education gathered early this year in Santiago at a meeting, and a special meeting convened by UNESCO and other stakeholders. And in their statement, they expressed that the states are obliged to guarantee the right to education. And that he also agreed on establishing a framework for the recovery of education, as well as a proposal for inclusive and effective financing. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. But at UNESCO, our colleagues of ECLAC and other organizations, all of us are working on these instruments so that they become a practical reference to accelerate our advances in the region and a framework of reference, including all national educational planning efforts. From our office in Santiago, we are supporting all these initiatives, and we are providing support to the implementation of regional strategies and projects. We are also providing support to communities of practice and networks that also back up the planning and management efforts. Just to mention a few examples, I would like to refer to the Latin American Laboratory for Evaluation of Educational Quality that will celebrate its 30th anniversary this year. It has promoted a culture of evaluation in the region. There is also a community of experts on data in a project coordinated together with the IIEP office. There is another project in Montevideo for students in situation of mobility, and also another project focused on students with disabilities. All these to promote inclusive systems. We celebrate the holding of this event that I'm sure will provide new inputs, trends, and discussions on such relevant topics. I just want to say that we are at your disposal from UNESCO. We are here to provide you with assistance. We don't have all the answers yet, but we are here to accompany you throughout this process where we are all looking for solutions for the future, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you all for listening. I would like to thank the IIEP team, Alejandra, and your team for organizing this event, and I wish you an excellent day. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Esther. Y ahora para cerrar este bloque, invitamos
Thank
a
you,
pasar
Esther.
al
And
director del
now,
Instituto
in
Internacional de
closing, we
Planeamiento
would
y
like to
Educación, Martín
invite the
Benavides.
director of the International Institute for Educational Planning, Martín Benavides, to take the floor. I have 20 minutes. Okay, no. Let me start by greeting all the authorities and the Secretary of Education, Carlos Torrendel, also the Secretary of Education of the Government of Honduras, some other representatives from federal governments who are here with us today. I would also like to thank Liz who hold this event. I also want to thank the ECLAC with Daniela Truco, who also provided us with assistance for this event. Greetings to you all, especially to Professor Fernandez Gamarra, who has joined us today, and I think that his presence is going to inspire us to find those answers that the Secretary of Education of Argentina is looking for. So let's get inspired in order to look for those answers. In effect, we are dealing with multiple challenges. Additionally, our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, is not in a priority position with regard to resource mobilization. Therefore, our role is a technical role. We look for alternatives to deal with all the challenges, but at the same time, we should consider the political elements. We need to mobilize international cooperation so that they can provide support to us to deal with all these challenges. Of course, there are challenges, but we should also acknowledge that there has been a lot of innovation in the region. Some examples are more better known than others. So we need to give public visibility. We need to take this to the public sphere and to make sure that we can go ahead and implement those innovations whenever we have the resources. And we also have to disseminate them outside of our region. We were lucky because we had a presentation from a representative from SUMA, Javier Gonzalez, targeting an audience from Africa and Asia. everybody was puzzled with what they saw and heard, so hopefully we will have enough time to share that information here as well. But there are also other reform initiatives in ministries to orient budgets towards results, and there are some activities linked to carrying out actions to stop the dropouts of girls from schools. And also, we are also moving from rural areas also to different types of settings. And we have now what we call the teach to the right level approach. This is something that we are doing with the multi-grade processes that we have been conducting for decades. So we should pay attention to those innovations and make room for them in our agendas among all the challenges that we are addressing. It is in that context that the IIEP, together with other institutions that have been mentioned here, and also governments, have decided to go ahead with this seminar. Once again, we are putting planning at the center of public debate. This is a change for us that can lead to new ideas around the need for planning. At the IIEP, we take that need, and as we said here, we try to innovate from a planning standpoint. And we have identified at least 4 areas of innovation that we would like to draw your attention to. First, we need to establish a more direct link between planning and the concrete classroom-related issues, as the Secretary was saying before. In our institute, in the 1970s, there was a document that was released that didn't have too much repercussions and aimed at a more egalitarian planning, starting from a concrete plan to address the problem of literacy, for instance. So here we need to have planning processes that aim at finding a solution to the problem that can really transform the classroom. This is one of the major challenges for us. That is why now you will see that we are also considering different areas that should be addressed by planning in the way we organize our activities. Secondly, planning is not just the planner's problem. Thinking that the IIEP should lead its planning program only for people working in ministerial planning offices is no longer valid, because there are many other stakeholders that intervene and engage with the planning process or with implementation of planned activities. So it would be a big mistake not to extend all these programs and these activities to other parties, not just inside the sector, but also outside the sector, because they can also play a relevant role at different levels of the planning process. So in our institute, we are transforming our own training courses, and we are also looking at the different points of intersection of the planning process. Third, we are trying to overcome this tension between planning and emergency resolution. You are now working in the sector, and you know that you need to address emergencies on a daily basis. I also went through that in my life. When we plan, we take into account a long-term view, but we need to clearly identify how we are dealing with the daily emergency situations. And that kind of response can also be part of the long-term planning process. So that means that we should not necessarily focus on the future. We can start by looking at what is happening now in order to see how we can envisage a different situation in the future. So in that regard, we may talk about humanitarian responses or responses from the point of view of sustainability, and that should no longer be a problem for planners because there are schools about this. Sometimes the Institute is told that it is not there to deal with humanitarian issues. Some claim that educational policies should not go in that direction. But that is also a discussion that we are having nowadays. And we are paying more attention to how we implement what we plan for. In recent years, the IIEP was more focused on large planning processes. Now we are looking at instruments to implement what we had planned for. We have the budget as a major tool, one of the most important instruments for us to know whether a plan is going to be successful or not. And the fourth discussion for us has to do with recognizing the importance of evidence, especially when they occur in a specific context and when we can acknowledge the specific experience of the different places in our region. But with the Santiago office, with Esther at the helm of that office. So I hope that you can find some solutions to the challenges during these 2 days of discussion. So welcome.
Muchas gracias, Martín. Bueno, con estas palabras damos cierre a esta primera parte del foro.
So now we conclude this first session of the forum. Let's give a round of applause to all the authorities. And let me remind you that we are streaming this event through YouTube, and we have a simultaneous interpretation into 3 languages. You can use hashtag #ForoIP2024 on our social media and X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. These sessions are also being recorded, so you will find the recordings afterwards in the Regional Forum website. Please remember that you can use the Menti app to answer a few questions because we want to know some topics. So you can do that during the forum. And those of you following us on YouTube, we are sharing the link through the chat. All right, so we will start with the next panel. Education plan in Latin America. I would like to welcome Alejandra Cardini, Acting Head of Office for IIEP-UNESCO, Daniela Truco, Social Affairs Officer from ECLAC, Jose Weinstein, Member of the Advisory Council. If you have questions, send them in writing through the paper notes that you will find in your binders. You can also add your name and your country. You can write your questions while the panel is taking place, and you can raise your hands so that someone will. Those on YouTube can also ask questions, and the moderator there is going to gather all those questions. Depending on the time available, we will address all those questions. You can also raise your
projecting where we want to know in the future, with many unanswered questions. So the first person here that I will introduce now Oh, so many words have come up. We will have to see how we connect this with all these words, but it's possible. So the first person I would like to introduce is Daniela Truco. She's a social affairs officer at the Social Development Department in ECLAC in Santiago, Chile. She's a sociologist. There are 3 sociologists in this panel. And she has been working at ECLAC for 15 years now. And for me, her contribution to this panel and why we asked her to join us is because she has a very cross-cutting approach to education because of her work, her 15 years at ECLAC, but also for her training and her previous experience. And she always connects, and that's what is so interesting for us in terms of what happens with education and development, the different age groups, the childhood education and employment. So we wanted to have that more general overview to think of educational policies and educational plans. So thank you for joining us. The other person I will introduce now is Jose Weinstein, also sociologist, PhD commissions in Honduras. So his approach and the support here is to think of this from the management challenges that are very different when you are in an international organization or at a university. So thank you, Danielle, for joining us. So now we have our cloud, our word cloud, and the idea for this panel today is to have some brief presentations from each of us and then an exchange related to those issues that may come up. Those that are sitting here, but also those that are following us remotely, please ask your questions, and at the end of the panel, the idea is to interact and answer those questions. So I'm supposed to start, so then I will pass the mic to you. This forum is very important for us because it brings back to the discussion an aspect that is core to our daily work, that is what is planning, and particularly what is planning today with all the changes that are being mentioned. So the idea is for this panel and also tomorrow, that is more specific for public officials, is to think about this topic, and we prepared a text. The QR code is there. The title is An Invitation to Plan the Future of Education in the Region, and that is the discussion we would like to have today. This is an invitation. Let's see what we can. I will start with some of these words that have been shared about what does it mean to plan? What does planning mean? But we know that without planning, we cannot reach what we want to achieve. For that, we have to analyze where we are. We have to project where we could be. What are those different scenarios? There are many texts about this. One is the Futures of Education of UNESCO that describes dark scenarios as to the future if the current actions are not changed. And from there, we can coordinate the actions in the present to achieve that idea of the future. And I think this appears in all these words that you shared. The current moment is very complex. I'm never sure whether it's the most complex of all. I'm sure there have been complex moments in the past, but all these things we mentioned, like climate change, the change of social relations after digitalization, armed conflicts, human mobility, those are areas that are very present today. That says if decisions are not changed and the policy about jobs, that is a high percentage of the workforce in Latin America and the Caribbean. Those are the types of things we have to by ECLAC published last week, and Daniela is going to discuss this, but ECLAC also mentions 3 traps in the region for many years now, and we have to get out of those. And these 3 traps have a lot to do with how we have to frame the ideas as how to plan education. The first is low growth, strong inequality, and the third one is key for IIEP the institutional weakness or the weak state capabilities. This text mentions 3 coordinates to discuss in this forum today. 3 coordinates we think might be useful for this invitation to think about our planning. And the first coordinate has to do with creating a community of planners, a community of educational policy that at the core of their concerns has where we want education to go, what we want to achieve socially, and what do we need from education to achieve that. This is also at the heart of IIEP, particularly the training. Many of us here, as Andrés mentioned, have been trained with IIEP, but obviously it's here we have to articulate collective efforts of all the organizations that are working regionally. In Latin America, there has a lot of organizations that are very experienced, like OEI, celebrating 75 years, and many others. And we have to leverage on that to generate this community. The community has to produce knowledge, narratives, that has to reach full consensus, but some ideas about how to move forward and work in coordination to reach those. Public officials, academics, CSOs, it goes beyond the government. And the second coordinate, so the first one is to strengthen this regional community, and the second has to do with something that our director of IIEP mentioned, Martín Benavides, and that is how to make planning reach the schools, because if it doesn't reach what happens at schools, then why plan? And this applies to the initial years of planning that reached the schools. That is something we asked Jose to try and help us think about it, because that connection between planning, what is designed schools, is not that clear. And I think it's a big question. What tools, what strategies to use for that to work? And the last, in order to plan, we need smart states, states that can connect both inside and outside. And we're experiencing situations where more and more people are away from the public service for many reasons. And there's also a difficulty sometimes of thinking, what are those government capabilities that are necessary for long-term planning? And this will be connected today with this panel, but also with the second panel that will deal with those cross-cutting capabilities that are needed. Some are from the government, others are different. But that's the third coordinate, how to work, how to strengthen the state, how to learn more and have more evidence as cutting, how the staff is hired in the government. And there are more that I'm sure Cecilia will discuss them in the afternoon. So with these 3 coordinates, I will now pass the floor first to Daniela Truco for her to give us this general overview of the region. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, UNESCO, IIEP. Thank you, UNESCO, OEI, Alejandra, Martín. Thank you for inviting us to be partners today. So in a few minutes, I will try to share the economic and social context in the region, as Alejandra mentioned. And this is a vital background to understand the place of education in the challenges in the development process. This is a key starting point for the planning process for a transformation of education. ECLAC has been saying that in the past few years, Latin America and the Caribbean is facing a crisis of the development model that is expressed in those 3 traps that Alejandra mentioned. In the latest economic study of ECLAC this year, it shows that the region is stagnant in the first trap, of low growth and poor performance of investment and low labor productivity. To that, we add a low techno space to implement macroeconomic reactivation policies and the global uncertainty. In the past decade, as you can see in the chart, the countries in the region have grown at an average rate of 0.9% in 2015-2024. That figure is lower than the figure in the lost decade of the 80s, as it was called. And ECLAC projects that this trajectory will be maintained. This low growth will be maintained at 0.8% this year. The slowdown of economic growth makes it more difficult to have a full recovery of employment. It increases the risk of informal jobs in a region that is already very informal. And the acceleration of inflation has a negative impact on the real income of individuals. The second trap, that is the high inequality conditioned by the productive matrix that characterizes the region, in multiple dimensions, is a trap that is an obstacle for the development to sustainable, the growth to sustainable development. Well, inequality is unacceptable in terms of the enjoyment of rights, social justice, but also it's inefficient for economic growth and it's corrosive for social cohesion and stability of the social pacts. Instability in the region is structural and historical. And according to the measurement of the Gini index, in the past 30 years, it persists as the most unequal region in terms of income in the world. Despite the levels of inequality have gone down in that period, as we can see in the left chart, we are still the line at the the thicker blue line at the top, that is the highest Gini index. And the region is also characterized by a low level of social mobility. There's no much possibilities for people in the most unfavored levels to reach a higher level, also their descendants. In the right, you can see information for 13 countries in the region, and you can see the probability that is considerably higher of participating in the labor formal market compared to the years of education of the population. Based on the figures of the latest Latin American report that we published every year, in 2022, the percentage of individuals in poverty in the region went down and went back to pre-pandemic levels, 29% of the population and 11.2% in extreme poverty. As you can see in the chart, the axis for inequality in the region lead to the incidence of poverty being higher in some groups of the population than for others, like girls, boys, and adolescents, such as you can see in the chart. The proportion is considerably higher than other age groups. The third trap that characterizes this crisis of development, has to do with low institutional capabilities and weak governance that limits the ability of the government to plan and implement effective policies to reflect on the needs of society. This is what the Educational Forum tries to do to renew the role of education.
This crisis of development is combined with other aspects that have already mentioned and makes things even more complex. Technological innovation, transforming economies and societies across the globe. Although these innovations bring benefits, they can also be a source of exclusion and deprivation of rights. And these also have an impact on our education systems, AI, but not just AI. Also, the accelerated demographic changes in the region that change the size and the profile of demands that we will have as the population ages, and also the intra-regional has increased and diversified over the last decades. There are some countries that didn't have any prior experience with migration. Now, this affects employment and education. Take all these into account in planning processes. And the climate crisis is another transformation that has been mentioned here. We celebrated the sessions of the ECLAC some days ago. We have all the documents available, and 11 essential transformations for the development models in the region were put forward. One of them speaks about having effective education for everyone and inclusion. So this is important in order to know what to do, but also to address something that is quite challenging, how we can manage these transformations so that they go in the right direction. This includes not just the technical aspects of policies, but also some coordination and leadership skills. The forum will address all these challenges within the setting of the region. So that is why we are so excited to be here all together with you. Thank you, Daniela. Jose, would you like to take the floor? I want to thank the IIEP for the invitation. I want to especially thank Martina and Alejandra for the invitation. Alejandra made a difficult request. In 7 minutes, just connect the macro and the micro levels of planning here. So I've tried to resort to my experience, not so much to my academic work to answer to that request. So I've been working in education for a long time. So I would try to go back to those things that have remained over time in the systems. And of course, they undergo some changes. They are not exactly the same as when they started, but they are the source of the capacity building. They are at the base of the system. This is quite important. There lies an important key for planning purposes. If we don't plan for those elements that will stay at the basis of the system, then we may make big mistakes. So I went back to the pandemic days, and I found an interesting Chilean program that has those characteristics of becoming ingrained or rooted. I'm going just to give you like 7 headlines to describe characteristics. The first one is that policy actions need to make sense for stakeholders. When the minister was talking about literacy, it's not just something that planners think is important. That should become ingrained, and all stakeholders should identify that as an essential need. Then, the learning diagnosis. During the pandemic, we didn't have any way of understanding what was happening with those children from a learning and emotional standpoint. The second characteristic is that underlying the action of the program, there should be a promise with achievements that can be confirmed, they can be checked. So there should be a clear metric to identify those results, and it should be validated somehow to make that standpoint legitimate. And we should also have some goal elements there, because the community needs to feel that progress is being made. It shouldn't just be a promise for the future, something that will be fulfilled in many years from now. So we should have those gold nuggets. The third one has to do with availability of new resources for schools. I'm talking about larger infrastructure. Resources need to be a point of support, something new that was not there before. For instance, you can measure learning results immediately with actionable metrics. The fourth element, the education policy or program should open opportunities for schools to develop their agency, especially among teaching staff. So these should not be vertical instructions set in a hierarchical format. There should be opportunities that enable teaching staff to develop their agency. The fifth element has to do with having key coordination roles for school authorities. It should be school authorities or principals who should bring in this innovation. So they play a very important role because they can coordinate the institutional pedagogical processes in the institution. I think there is an element, that is time. Policies and programs should be well managed from a time standpoint. They should also fit with the calendar, with the school calendar year. And they should also allow for a significant time for maturity. And the last element is that these programs or initiatives have to be consistent with other competing initiatives or programs. Someone said earlier that sometimes we just accumulate programs. Sometimes we don't realize that the new program that we are implementing can be in conflict with other initiatives that are already in place in the school. So, in order to plant a seed, we need to have fertile ground. That is extremely important. These are the 7 characteristics that I think that the programs that can become ingrained or nested in the school could have. So we need to have a focus on capacity building. I think that is core for a good planning. You need to have the capabilities there in order to deal with uncertainty and to be flexible enough in light of new threats. I'm not saying that we need to study all the predictions or future scenarios that other organizations produce. That is important, of course, but we always need to contribute to capacity building. Then we also need to make sure that all this makes sense for stakeholders. We need to do serious research. This is not just a matter of language. It is also a matter of communication and a matter of identifying needs, the methodologies, finding the right role for authorities. And this kind of program combines 2 major trends in school improvement. The trend that comes from these programs into the schools, improvements that are pushed from the ministries, and these should also be combined with those improvements that have their origin inside the school and move outwards in order to ensure quality education. So these shouldn't be mutually exclusive. They should be coordinated. The schools cannot work alone, and the ministries cannot work alone without the help of the schools. So in order to improve, we need to bring together those two approaches. These are the inputs, the elements that I wanted to share with you from the macro and micro levels point of view.
Bien, buenos días para todos y para todas. Muchísimas gracias.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. This is very important for us. Honduras right now is undergoing its sixth educational reform, and there are lots of questions. The school has been like this for 200 years already without changes. I think I'm the first millennial Minister of Education in my country, and we have an important generation of millennial teachers already facing an educational reality of the past century. So in that context, planning is the most important tool to give consistency to the teaching and learning process. When we ask our students why they want to study, the decision for the children but we've had an interruption in the sound. Let's not speak about, PhDs and master's degree. That is the student's decision. But planning should be used to give consistency, not just to the school, but what is the school good for in society? Because if the school is a place where citizens are educated to live in democracy and to grow the economy, well, so we have a huge debt in our region in that context. Second, planning based on what happens in the classroom and in its transformational quality. I mean, why should we fill the classroom with very well planned contents, but they do not transform our environment in the school? So the planning has to be focused on that transformational quality of the teaching and learning process. And the miracle of education is not possible without a close relationship between what happens in the classroom and planning. That's why we have extraordinary teachers. Sometimes the students love them. We never forget them, but then in the scenario of this process of educating to contribute to a better society, those are isolated efforts. So it's so important for planning also to happen in the classroom. Now, what are some of the other issues? As educators, and that happens a lot in my country, we professors and teachers are focused on carrying out the contents of the plan, and we forget what is the most important part, that is what happens inside us. Teachers are embedded in the planning, in the demands of the planning, and in the standard, but we have forgotten to touch the souls of our boys and girls, and that is where the school loses sense. The children are not just a computer that we fill with content and then they turn into machines that can reproduce the society we dream for. That's why it's so important for teachers today. They do not truly understand their role in the teaching and learning process, and we are just reproducing content. That's why it's so important for plans to be relevant, easy to follow, applicable in a practical way in the classroom, but most importantly, the education around the school should be aware of that planning and of what is happening in the classroom. That is, each academic activity should contribute to the planning for all of society. Right now in Honduras, we are developing a planning. It hasn't been completed. It's our 365 plan that seems to be very easy. But actually, it's very complex. It has three essential pillars. First, that our youth reach happiness. But how do we plan for that? That is what should be for all of us to be happy and feel realized, and then to reduce poverty, inequality, and strengthen democracy. How do we do that from the school? And on the other hand, an educational system that was thought by our founding fathers. How from my science or mathematics class, how can I contribute to those pillars? In my planning, in the classroom, I should contribute to those three pillars. And on the other hand, our associated factors that very often in the classroom and in the planning, they're not that well defined. And that is school food. We can have the best plans, the best curricula, the best teachers, but if our children are not fed, they won't learn. On the other hand, materials, books, how those textbook materials favor the teaching and learning process. In the same dimension, furniture, technology, and a very important element that is the training and research on the part of our teachers. We do not research a lot. We are teaching dead science. So in that context, we need to have a dialogue where the teachers can review the plans, but mainly they can contribute to the improvement of the planning so that it's permanently reviewed. The educational system has to be constantly improving. Another element that is essential for us is the educational environment, not what happens in the school, in the high school. We mean everything that happens around the school, because by contributing to the first element, we say that the school should be at the core of the development of the community. So not only the children that go to school or their parents, but everybody around the school should have a connection, businesses, the church, farmers. And the final element is the school infrastructure that for us is very complicated in our country, but mainly how we use that school infrastructure, not just for the teaching learning process, but also to serve the community. Let's move on to the final slide. We are running out of time. In our reality, this translates into 5 objectives that look simple, but they are very complex. First, for our children to read and write, to understand what they read and write, mathematical logic, digital skills, and being able to transform the environment. And this is the most important goal. I learn maths, but how do I contribute to society? I learn history, but how does that contribute to society? That has translated into 7 strategic projects. That is initial training of our teachers, the literacy program. And now to conclude, all this makes sense if we can assess it to improve educational practices and measure the plans. I fully agree that sometimes in education we have minor achievements, but nobody celebrates that. And we always say that the system doesn't work, that it doesn't take us anywhere. So how will motivate women, parents, farmers, the children themselves to be willing to go to school if the school is always doing a poor job? So even if it's a minor achievement, we have to celebrate it, because an advancement in society, particularly in complex societies like ours, deserves to be celebrated. And finally, how do we evaluate that? If we cannot evaluate the 3 pillars and the 6 elements that are the associated factors and the 5 objectives, for that we are building an evaluation mechanism for the educational system, not just of the learning. That is how we move forward in those associated factors that contribute to the improvement of education. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, secretario. Bueno, la idea ahora es elegir una de las frases
we would like to take one phrase from each presentation and get other panelists' reaction to those phrases. First, Secretary of Education from Honduras said that we need to plan in order to build an education system that eradicates poverty and inequality while building. So, Daniela, could you react to that phrase, please, to that statement?
Bueno, venimos trabajando con el
Well,
ministro Sponda desde la CEPAL, con
I've been
UNICEF hace ya un
working
par de
with
años, nuevamente
Secretary Sponda
en el
at the
fortalecimiento
CLAC
de la
for
planificación y
years
de las capacidades
to
institucionales. Yo creo que
strengthen
eso
institutional
es
capacities,
uno de los
and
elementos claves
I think that is a key
para
element
justamente poder planificar mejor
to
y tener alguna
improve
capacidad de medir resultados
planning
y celebrar logros,
and
¿no?
to have some way
Creo
of
que es
measuring
central. Y
our
quizás quisiera
outcomes
aprovechar
and celebrate our
profundizar un poco más
achievements.
en el documento que yo les contaba de la
And
CEPAL,
let me
donde
go deeper
justamente se
into the
buscaba cómo
IC
en los
document that I
cómo
mentioned
hacer, no
before,
solo qué, sino cómo hacerlo,
where we
y
try to
cuáles son los tipos
examine
de
how
capacidades
we can
institucionales
move
que
forward
creemos que los ministerios de
and what
educación y las
kind of
secretarías de educación
institutional capabilities
podría priorizarse
ministries
para
and
fortalecer. Por una parte
secretariats
están las
of
capacidades técnicas,
education should
donde
focus
está la
on. We have
planificación
technical
estratégica, la construcción
capabilities
de una
with
visión,
strategic
un liderazgo, que es un
planning,
poco lo que presentó el
vision
ministro.
building, leadership
También muy
building.
importante
This is
fortalecer
what
las
the
capacidades
minister
técnicas para
said. It
asegurar
is
la
also
sostenibilidad
important to
financiera
strengthen
desde
technical
las secretarías de
capabilities
educación.
to
Creemos que es clave
guarantee
la consolidación de
financial
los
society,
sistemas de evaluación, de monitoreo de resultados, que es algo que hemos
consolidating
estado trabajando en conjunto
systems
para la gestión de la
for
política educativa.
result
Y después hay
monitoring
capacidades
and
operativas
evaluation.
del
And then we
aprovechamiento
have some
digital, por ejemplo, en la
operational
gestión educativa, que es el
capabilities,
mejoramiento de
taking
los procesos de
advantage of
enseñanza, que es
digital
algo que muchos de los
tools
países de la región
in
están trabajando por
education
fortalecer.
management, and also
Dentro de eso, el fortalecimiento de los sistemas de
strengthening
alerta temprana,
teaching
el seguimiento de
capabilities,
logros de
strengthening
aprendizaje
early
según lo
warning
definido
systems,
a nivel curricular.
looking at the different
Y también
learning
el
methods
fortalecimiento de
according
políticas
to
de
what is
recursos
defined
humanos
in the
dentro de
curriculum,
las
and
secretarías
then
de educación
the
y
HR
de las
policies
instituciones más
inside
descentralizadas de
the
los ministerios,
ministries of
y el
education
fortalecimiento
and
de la formación y
secretariats of
carreras
education,
docentes. Después
and
están las
strengthening
capacidades más
also
políticas que llamamos, que
staff,
tienen que ver con
teachers,
la definición de mecanismos
career
y
development.
modalidades de diálogo social para la
Then
gestión
we
de
can
acuerdos más
also
amplios
speak
y
about social
de plazos más
dialogue
largos de los
modalities
que
in order
nos
to
permite la política muchas veces, acuerdos
enter
de gobierno y
longer
Estado.
term
Y el
agreements
fortalecimiento de la
that can
articulación
later
del sector
on
educativo, que
transform
eso no
with
lo puede
all
solo, ¿no?
the
Que hay que
barriers.
establecer
We need to
condiciones
work together with others.
posibles para
We
que los
can't do
estudiantes puedan
that
educarse.
alone in
Y el
education.
robustecimiento y coherencia y articulación de las políticas nacionales con las
And then
subnacionales, tan importante en países, por
strengthening
ejemplo,
the
como este,
linkage in
federados, ¿no? Finalmente
federal
están las
and
capacidades
state
prospectivas, que es un poco
level
lo que yo cité
policies.
antes, que tiene que ver
And finally,
con
we
tener,
have
fortalecer
what I
competencias
presented before, the
en
needs
que podamos determinar cuáles son las competencias que tenemos
and
que ir formando en
abilities
las
to
nuevas
determine
generaciones de
the
estudiantes,
competences
de
that
acuerdo a los
need to
cambios que
be
estamos viviendo
developed
en la
in
sociedad
the
cada
new
vez más
generation of
acelerado.
students based on the changes
Procesos
that
de
we see
actualización
now in
curricular a partir de un
society,
diálogo participativo,
curricular
y
update
finalmente también desarrollar
processes,
escenarios futuros
and
de la
also
sostenibilidad
work on
financiera de la
future
educación,
scenarios for
considerando las
financial
transformaciones demográficas, por
sustainability of
ejemplo.
education, considering all demographic
Eso.
changes, among
Muchas
others.
gracias.
Thank
Si
you.
alguno quiere... Bueno.
Bueno, voy a tratar de ser muy
I'll
breve. Uno
be
de
brief.
los temas que nosotros identificamos en uno de los problemas de la
One of the
planificación es que,
problems that we
por un lado, está la
identify
cómo vas a
in
erradicar la
planning,
pobreza
on
si
the
estás
other
educando para
hand,
el
how are
desempleo.
you going to eradicate
Y eso
poverty
es
if
uno de
you
los
are
graves problemas que
educating
tienen nuestros
for
sistemas educativos
employment,
en la
or
región. Y
how
el
are you
otro
going
aspecto que es
to
un paradigma que nosotros estamos luchando por
ensure
cambiar en
that the
nuestro país
country
es
grows if
siempre que
you are
hablamos de
focusing on
dinero para educación,
education?
hablamos de
So
gasto.
whenever we speak about
El
money
gasto
for
en educación,
education,
que
we are
cuánto se está
referring
gastando
to
en
this
educación,
as
que
the
nunca alcanza,
expenditure on
¿cierto?
education.
Pero cuando
On
hablamos
education.
del
So
dinero que
when
ponemos en
we
educación,
look at
hablamos en gasto.
this
Y
from a
cuando
macro
hablamos con nuestra gente,
perspective,
le decimos que
when
esa
we
es la mejor
focus on
inversión.
money
Definir
as
presupuestos que
an
sean
expense, we
sostenidos en el
say
tiempo
that
porcentualmente para que se
education is the
puedan
best
invertir en
investment.
educación es
So in those
fundamental.
of us
Quedamos es administrar
in
lo que
the
ya está.
ministries of
Y
education
tenemos muy
can
pocos
only
recursos para
manage what
investigar y
is
para
already
innovar.
there, and we have
Entonces,
very
¿cómo
few
nos piden a
resources
los
to
ministros de educación,
innovate
a los
and
secretarios de
to
educación,
do
que cambiemos
research.
lo que está
So
ocurriendo, el
how
desastre
can we
educativo, si
change
no tenemos
the
recursos para hacer inversiones
educational
estratégicas que nos
disaster that
permitan
we have
transformar
if
los
we
sistemas
don't have
educativos?
resources to
Sin
make strategic
recursos, sin
investments to
investigación
achieve
y
a
sin
transformation.
innovación,
Without
no va a haber
resources,
ninguna
without
transformación
research,
educativa.
without innovation
Pasar
can
en
be
realidad a la
possible.
tercera frase,
Thank
porque
you.
la siguiente sigue,
Now we are going
que
to
es
move on to the
una
third
frase de
statement
José que
here
surgió en una charla que
that
tuvimos,
was
que es en un contexto de cambios
mentioned
y
by
incertidumbre,
Jose in a
planificar a largo
discussion
plazo
we had.
parece o
Change
parecer
and
peligroso.
uncertainty,
Yo tomé
long-term
esta frase
planning may
para
be
reaccionar porque me
meaningless.
parece que es la
I
pregunta también
chose this statement for us to reflect on it, because I think that it is key for these 2 days of gathering. So, what is the purpose of having 10-year educational planning today? What kind of time frame should we consider in our planning actions? However, we still have to consider the long term when we plan, as Daniela was saying, but perhaps we should consider 3 characteristics. One has to do with combining the long-term view with a swift approach to address urgent problems that cannot wait for so long. So we need to identify those problems that require an urgent response. In the second place, planning has to be a distributed and coordinated practice. I'm thinking about distributed leadership, how planning traditionally from this audience of government officials, when actually should also target the middle levels in order to connect those 3 spaces efficiently. And coordination has to do with that, with connecting the different government levels. And the last one has to do with providing timely answers in a swift manner. And I think that we saw this during the pandemic. Many governments quickly understood what the situation was like, and they tried to respond to that situation. Alejandro Moruchovitz says something that I really like. During the pandemic, governments were able to find answers to reactions from the panelists. Otherwise, we can move on to the other statement. This is something that I said. Educational planning is pointless if it does not translate into real changes in people's lives and if it is not put into practice in schools. What's your reaction to this? Well, then we need to see whether there are any agreements. Do we have any agreement, any majority agreement in our societies? When you ask someone if the educational system is working, most of the people would say, no, it is not working, but it's very difficult to know how to transform that reality. Just this issue is left in the hands of technicians. Please don't misunderstand me, but this is the reality in our countries. So along those lines, we are struggling in our country to establish a pact for education, to see what are our shared objectives, so that we have some level of agreement. So we all agree on the fact that we need funds. So we want to finance. In Honduras, we have 3 to 6 years of education. We have 3 years of preschool education, then we have basic or primary education, and then we have 6 years for secondary education. So we need to revisit our plans, but we are always looking for immediate results. But actually, results in education take time. It's not something that you can produce overnight, like in a factory where you produce a certain good. That doesn't happen in the classroom. So planning is very important. We need to know if we have the consensus of the majority, because one of the major problems we face is that sometimes we have very nice plans, but we just have administrations that are in power for 6 years. Then a new administration takes office and all this is changed. So we need to have a plan that is sustained over time. aiming at those large goals so that the system makes sense as the most precious good for societies. I think that what the minister is saying is extremely important. Somebody mentioned Juan Carlos Tedesco here, and I also want to mention him. Another thinker was Richard Elmo, who left us some time ago. And he would say something that sounded quite dramatic, but it was quite relevant. He was referring to ministries, or actually to the superintendents of education in the United States. And he would portray this image that they just have like grinding of policies. So new authorities come into power. They promise that they will solve problems. They don't solve as quickly as they need it, so that authorities leave and then new authorities come back. So it was like a cycle, like this carousel, always go round and round. People who promise big results, but
que trasciendan un poco la duración del ministro de Educación. No quiero decir que no sea muy bueno tener ministro de Educación que dure mucho. Ojalá dure mucho.
I'm not saying that it's not good to have long-term ministers of education, but somebody took some statistics. Perhaps you just have a minister in that role for 1.5 years up to 3.5 years. In some cases, you have ministers that stay longer in that position. But and I think that we need to consider what economists have done with the economy. This doesn't happen in every country, but some countries have autonomous central banks with the mission of making sure that inflation will not skyrocket. So they put in place some rules, and regardless, that is a body that is not just a consultative body. It also has to send its suggested changes to the government. For instance, one minister wanted to change the whole curriculum. So now that we have, before we had that body in place, the minister could have gone ahead with that change. But now the minister, in order to get that change approved, has to submit that change proposal to the National Education Council. Another minister said that we had to eliminate our learning outcome measurement system, but that cannot be changed just like that. It has to go through the approval of the council. So I'm saying that we need to have that kind of governance system where all the changes in education do not depend on just one single authority. There should be a body that allows us to have sustainability over time. That is an interesting point, to have governance capability outside the ministry. The last statement also has to do with this idea of making the system immune. One of the traps that characterizes the development crisis is that of low institutional capacity and weak governance, which limit the capacity of governments to plan and implement effective policy. This is what Daniela Trucco said in her vision. Jose, would you like to read?
Of course, in this case, I think that the issue of governance it's very important to include there, apart from having this division, a more pluralistic and balanced governance system. Also, we should include the intermediate levels, not just the national level. And that's not only in countries with decentralized systems, but also in more centralized countries like ours. Well, Axel here has worked on that. He did a very interesting research showing cases of intermediate levels that were successful in the region. I think that intermediate level is to be highlighted, not just thinking of national ministries, but also think of levels that are between the schools and the national ministries that also have those capabilities. Because no matter how good the national ministries are, no matter how good the officials are, the professionals in those ministries, the truth is that they will be very far from that reality. Additionally, all our countries, no matter how big or small, they have very specific cultural elements, and the education has to respond to that somehow. And those intermediate levels also have that task, not only of being good transmitters of national policies, that's one of their tasks, but better to adjust, relate, respond to a more local context, and therefore give a specific shade to that education. So different places in the country do not have the same education, but an education that is appropriate to that region. Think of my country, for instance. We have from the most arid deserts in the world to Patagonia. So those are realities where you cannot educate in the same way. It's very difficult for a school to generate value proposals for different realities, but the intermediate level can do it. So I think I would add to that phrase that when we think of this chain where there's also an element that we have not paid attention to enough in the past.
Muy de acuerdo. Proteger las trayectorias
In order
educativas. Proteger las trayectorias
in order
educativas,
to
¿no? De aquellos
protect the educational trajectories, particularly in those students that we lose along the way. Thank you. For me, there are three essential elements in the area of governance. The first is teachers. Whenever there's an education transformation, there are consultations, etc. But truly the teachers that are the executors of the plans, they're not taken into account. There's no educational reform process or any healthy governance in an educational system without the participation of educators. Second, how is that connected to the educational community? And the other element I think is very important is the example he mentioned about the central banks. The same happens with the ministries of foreign affairs. Officials at the ministries of foreign affairs, no matter what party is in the power, that professional staff stays. But that doesn't happen so much in education. How to professionalize the secretariats or ministers of education to ensure that the most important, the most senior technical cadres don't have to restart educational policies all over again. And the third element is parliaments, Congress, where laws are drafted. An official of the executive branch has to execute and enforce the laws adopted in Parliament, and sometimes many acts were passed in Parliament, but they will lead to lack of governance in the educational system. So there's a direct connection between the ministries of education and the laws that are passed by Congress. And those acts, those laws that are passed will allow us to improve governance, but particularly aimed at achieving the big objectives that we have defined. Thank you, audience, both in person or remotely. The first one is very interesting because it has a lot to do with what we have been discussing. So perhaps we can all answer in another one. He is with
acompaña.
to institutionalize the processes of educational practice. The Secretary mentioned the difficulty of implementing some of the laws. Who would like to answer first? A factor to be considered for institutionalization, that's the question. Well, for me, we should be based in the reality of the community. For a planning to be institutionalized, we should be able to review it, evaluate it. It has to come from the needs of the community. We've made an effort in Honduras to divide the country into regions, 5 educational regions. So in a reality, it's a very small country. We had a lot of high schools, 17 high schools, but many of those high schools, for instance, were not relevant to the socio-economic reality of their locations. So how to plan? How do you expect outcomes that will allow the system to be relevant and educate for employment if what was planned at the capital city has nothing to do with the rural reality, for instance? How do you improve the educational system if when the children graduate, their degrees are only used as an ornament at home? In my generation, we no longer hang our degrees on the walls, but it's important to improve educational systems, and for that they have to be relevant to the community, relevant degrees, relevant higher education for the community to feel a direct contact and the usefulness of school for development. That allows us to keep planning. We created a generation of a certain school that contribute to the economic growth of the community. That economic growth generates more jobs, and then the educational system is forced to create new courses. Or I think in the region, we are developing degrees that 5 years from now will not make any sense in the labor market. I think that's the most important element of planning, how from the school we respond to the problems of the community. Thank you. We can move on with this one. I think that we've mentioned several factors that are central for this, but to summarize, I think that establishing institutionalized modalities for dialogue in a wide sense, advised by the community. How is the community engaged? How are the teachers engaged? So it's important to go deeper into that. The opportunities for engagement we have in the school, the school councils, they have different names, but that should be an area of high participation. The same, the places where teachers meet, those spaces, they need to have a voice in the planning processes that is clearer. The general vision, we've just made a general revision actually about these organizations, is that they are very diverse depending on the country. In some countries, these, like the teachers' councils, are absolutely optional, and they are used just randomly. In other cases, they have clear regulations as to the councils. They're more community-based. They exist. They are created by law, but how much they are used, that varies a lot. As the secretary from Honduras mentioned, and also Daniela, about this need to have an institutionalization, having bodies that can plan, but that has a strong participation in the social base. So these entities have to be alive throughout the process. There's a question here for the Secretary of Education of Honduras. We don't have much time. It's a hard question from Nancy Montes. She's here. What components are included in the evaluation of the system that you are planning? Well, first, having a new paradigm for evaluation. We are not against standardized planning, as it's done in many agencies, but we are aware that we will not pass them. And our teachers and our children suffer in their morale. After those evaluations, what you see on TV is that Honduras is failing again in education. How do you explain to a farmer that is making such a huge effort to send their children to school that they're going to fail anyway? So we are based on the associated factors. That's where we start from, and that has to be done by the state. I mean, if our government received, for example, 10% of acute child malnutrition, well, to what extent is the government trying to reduce that? Because we have to understand that if children are fed, we can achieve the first objective, that is to read and write well. How do you ask a kid to read and write if he has no food? So part of our evaluation is based on those associated factors, that is school food, textbooks, materials, furniture, infrastructure, the training and research of our teachers, and how that is connected to the educational environment. It's not easy because we have to recognize we're not going to achieve all the objectives at once. But as he said, we are not thinking of the big gold bullion, but in the little gold balls. If we manage to reduce child malnutrition, if we can improve the number of textbooks per student, if we repair more schools, those are the achievements of the system that we have to identify. And that should contribute to the improvement of the 5 objectives, the ability to understand, to analyze, etc. Those are the elements that we want to evaluate, and they should help us measure the trajectory of the system, not just country has school infrastructure in the right conditions. That's another step forward. If a country eradicates child malnutrition, so moving to the objectives that we have defined, knowing we have some deficiencies in the associated factors, but we have to move forward in parallel, and we cannot wait until we improve. We cannot wait to improve the quality of education until we have solved all those associated factors. But that mechanism of evaluation will allow us to know whether the governments are moving forward, for instance, in malnutrition. If, Mrs. President, we commend you for your achievements, or hurry up because you promised a 2% reduction and you have not achieved it. And we can keep measuring whether the policies defined by the political elites can move forward. And now we are in a very interesting process with the municipal corporations. In my country, there are 208 municipalities. In my administration program, that is Champions for Education, that is a municipal corporation decides to register voluntarily and competes, but not against the other 297 municipalities, but against itself. That is, the mayor of that municipality has these statistics as the baseline and is committed to moving forward in these aspects. And at the end of the period, we conduct the evaluation and we define whether a municipality is a champion of education because they have achieved their goals. Not the gold ingot, but the proposal is to go step by step to build that gold bullion. Okay, nice build that gold bullion. Okay, nice metaphor about the gold and the ingots. So we have to close now. I'd like to thank you all for being here, for joining us, and for your thoughts. We'll keep thinking about this today and tomorrow. So thank you so much. Mercedes, the floor is yours again.
Thank
you, Alejandra, and to all the panel. Thank you all for your attention. We invite you to come off the stage. And with this, we conclude the first panel of this Regional Forum on Education Policy. We are going to take a break now. For those who are with us in the room, we invite you to go down to the ground floor for lunch. You can do it slowly because we have time, so there's no rush. And during lunch, we also invite you to visit the recording studio we have prepared on the ground floor if you want to share your testimony about the forum. And we will meet again at 2:30 Argentina time for panel 2, a discussion on critical issues in educational planning in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you so much.